Hi, my name is Leigh Lester. I am a multidisciplinary artist and a UTSA graduate from 1993. I work in drawing, sculpture, cut paper. I am inspired by genetic modification in plants. I came to that point because I ended up getting excited about, many years ago, the genetic testing of family diseases. I then, paying attention to that scientific trajectory, I started to look into genetics, and by way of that ended up finding out about modifying plants genetically. My most recent work is inspired by two drawings that I did many years ago, probably about 15 and 13 years ago, that I've then combined, sampled from, mutated visually through a computer program, and then I end up hand drawing or hand cutting or hand painting everything. In my original drawings, I do an enormous amount of research that ends up looking into how the variety of plants that I've combined, and because of genetic modification can be combined, those different attributes. I look into geographically where they find themselves, environmentally where they would find themselves, how they propagate via spores or rhizomes, and I end up taking the most disparate information and smashing it together visually. I also sample from different sources of scientific information, which is of interest to me as well, because I end up doing a lot of research on what was the scientific understanding and belief of different time frames, all the way back to, say, the 1500s, and to what was encapsulated in that time, how the understood history and information ends up being brought forward for so many years and presumed to be correct, and in fact ends up being, through technology, ends up being found out to be untrue. So I'm examining the fact that through science we can end up creating something that doesn't necessarily go together, but then what are the after effects of that? Will we end up finding out that putting a flounder gene into a tomato so that it doesn't freeze at a certain temperature, where will that put us? What will be the eventual outcome of the manipulation of those things? Another element of my work is having to do with what happens once you create these entities, put them out into nature. And as most people know, through a lot of the environmental awfulness that we've had through wildfires or through hurricanes, you can't control nature. So once something is released out into nature and propagates, it then ends up being an uncontainable entity that will end up mutating and taking the natural course of its evolution into a completely different thing, but we've actually manipulated it into something that we want it to be. I look at my entire body of work that started with 3 drawings, and I think of it as a slow motion animation. I want you to slow down as you do when you're in nature and you pay attention to insects crawling across the ground, to slow down and pay attention to the visual vocabulary that keeps popping up into the work that I do. So if you look at my entire body of work, the same plants will pop up, but they've been manipulated and mutated and then put back into that visual vocabulary, finds its way back into the work. And now I've taken to doing blind contour drawings that end up further distorting the information of the plant. I then take that blind contour, paint it, and then cut it out and drape it. So if you were to lie the images that you see in some of the work here, if you were to put it on the ground, it would be reminiscent of that visual vocabulary, but because it's draped and hung and sculpted onto an armature, onto a drawing, it ends up being something that is less identifiable. It's also about sort of building nature around whatever the human need is, instead of respecting the natural process of evolution and what nature actually does best for us and worse for us. So it started out, some of the work that I did in the very beginning, it was about the idea of a copy, a perfect copy. And if you end up genetically cloning something, which was the starting point of sort of a fascination in cloning, in genetics, you end up having a new iteration of it. So I would, inspired by the artist Henry Darger, who was a janitor who would have died in obscurity if he was a major influence for me, would have died in obscurity if his landlord hadn't been an artist. And she ended up finding it, and now he's had documentaries made of him and books done of his 15,000-page book of the Vivian girls who fought tyranny, and they ended up being traced from magazine imagery. So I got fascinated with that technique of tracing and the idea of a copy, and so these images can reintroduce themselves, these characters reintroduce themselves into Henry Darger's work. And I thought, well, what an interesting thing to kind of create a copy. So I started doing all this research about different herbariums and different botanical depictions, and started tracing those images and layering those images. And in layering them on drafting film, I ended up finding that they had a recessive and a dominant feel to them visually. And so those things eventually ended up being layered drawings that I eventually worked into resolved plants that were just a one surface plant. Then that became eventually a copy of a copy that eventually became using things like carbon paper, which was the way that people would copy documents that maybe none of y'all have ever heard of. But I was intrigued, much like the different techniques or scientific assumptions. I used a copy and then created an image that was then printed onto the surface with the carbon paper, and then I added new information so that the presumed perfect copy, imitatia perfecta, which is found in this exhibit as well, ends up being, if you pay attention, different information and vocabulary pops up through the course of the same base plant and ends up finding its way into more mutations that weren't anticipated. Much like my entire body of work is all sourced from the same information of this highly researched, highly informed collection of different plants and different science information, different presumptions, and then ending up taking it into blind contouring it, just drawing it without looking at the page. And blind contour ends up serving as a purpose to distort and change the image in the way that evolution would. And then because it's distorted by not really being able to see how I'm manipulating it, and so it just sort of happens in the way that it would in nature, I then take that base clean line drawing, and then I incorporate more resolved information, more detailed information. And so on these large-scale drawings, I end up doing, putting in more clarification, as though like different points in the work end up finding their crystallization. And then the rest of it is still yet to be determined. Any of the colors that you see in my work, they're from the original 3 drawings, one of which is a graphite drawing, but the other 2 are graphite and colored pen. So I take that information, process it through the computer program, and end up distilling what is visually plant. Obviously, there's no question this is a plant. And then it distills it into color cells. It's still the plant information. The plant information is still applied, but it's just gotten microscopic and unidentifiable. I then take those color cells and apply them to all of the drawings that I've ever done that are related to this family of work. And I end up putting those color cells onto more plant information. They're solid structures that then, if I put them on the cut paper pieces that you see in this show, I let the negative space fall away, and then they become more plant information. And then the sculptural parts that I call cells make shadows end up being plant information from the absolute original drawings and cut paper pieces that I've done. And so once again, through every piece that I've done through this body of work ends up being generated by the information that originally started in these 3 pieces. There is a link between my current work and, as I mentioned earlier, the genetics aspect of what drew me to this subject matter in the first place, and it was through genetic family illness testing. I have a body of work that was the core interest of what are inherited family diseases, what are and how those inherited family diseases become family portraits, because they can go down generations, much like the entire body of my work gets passed down and the information gets passed down. And the pieces that you see in the exhibit are illnesses that are inherited, but they're put in frames that are meant to mimic the idea of portraiture that you see in museums, and how you have a very elaborate frame and you have a portrait, and then you end up having a brass plaque that'll indicate who it is and what maybe the king or queen of wherever ended up reigning and what their name was. And on these pieces, it ends up having the disease that is inheritable and the year that it became apparent in the family that had this inherited disease, the month and year that it became obvious to this particular person. One of which is the lung cancer was my mother, who ended up, and it was the first piece I did to sort of honor her, and then it became this other extension of other members of my family, but then also friends whose parents are an individual artist that I know who has osteoporosis. And the solid color pieces end up being interior household paint, and they're named, and the pithy names that they have, but I ended up matching different pathology with like the damaged portion of the organ or maybe a byproduct of the illness, and I would put them together with, say, alcoholism is the color of the Easter egg. And Alzheimer's is the color of homestead, which is just, I mean, what are the chances that an iridic plaque would actually end up being the color of homestead, and you lose all sense of home through Alzheimer's? And so those things, with the idea of you would paint the walls of your house and you would end up living in that space in the way that in your body you live with the disease that's within it. That then relates to, it comes all the way back around to current work that I'm doing and work that I did 15 years ago based on these genetically modified plants, or plants that I visually modified and amalgamated into work that then becomes generational and passed down through generations of my work. And the different projects that I've had over the course of my body of work end up all in an odd way being related to the transition of information. Even in the early works that have nothing to do with botany, it's always a before, middle, after. It's always a process-oriented thing. And some of the drawings of the soft stuff that have buckles on them, and they all end up talking about a process through which things move through the course of like an illness or the course of evolution, and all of them end up, it's pretty interesting when you sort of look back at your own work to sit there and see how so much has changed, but in a lot of ways, nothing ever changes. Thank you so much for listening. Enjoy the show.
That was fantastic.
Oh, Bob, you're going to be famous. You are.
You're doing good.